Wishing you a pleasant day and a warm welcome to your favorite show Law and Order. Today we are going to focus about one of the most important areas when it comes to the rights of the employees and employers. So we're talk about the EPF and ETF related issues today in our program Law and Order. So to do the honors with us, we do have one of the most thorough gentlemen to discuss of this discipline, Mr. Rajiv Amarasuriya, attorney at law. Thank you very much, sir, for joining with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Right. So when it comes to a start of for today's topic, the EPF and ETF related issues, and sir, what are the employment legislation in Sri Lanka?
Yes, so we have on EPF and ETF, we have two acts, the Employees Provident Fund Act and the Trust Fund Act. So those two basically regulate how the EPF and ETF operate. So these are superannuation benefits. These are benefits so that at the end of one's employment,
right,
that one would have some kind of saving. So it's saving each month, both in respect of EPF, both the employer and the employee contribute. ETF, it's only the employer, and you build up savings. This is for those who do not have a pension scheme. Now the EPF and ETF acts exclude those who have, for example, government employees, government servants, who would anyway be getting a pension once they finish their employment. But for others, you will get a lump sum once you retire, which has been collected in the form of Employees Provident Fund and Employees Trust Fund.
Right. So when it comes to the employment, contract of employment and contract for employment, there are two different disciplines discussed.
Yes.
What are the differences?
It's important. The contract of employment is the employee, which we speak of. Say someone's working in an establishment, someone working in a company, a garment factory, or an employee. Then you have a contract for employment is where it is an independent contractor. Right. Say you're building your house, you give it to somebody to come and construct, or you want your furniture polished. Then you give somebody who will come and bring the material, bring the polish and do the job and go. So you pay that person for that. So that is an independent contractor. Right. He is not your employee. But so all these benefits come in EPF and ETF. The regime is in respect of an employee. So if you have an employee who you hire to say work for you, say in your manufacturing outlet or your shop or whatever, then you are liable to pay in terms of the act, EPF and ETF. Now, the examples I told you, Charita, are very clear. The person who comes to polish your furniture is not your employee. Right. There is no doubt. And someone who works for you in your manufacturing outlet is your employee. But there are instances where, especially in the modern world, in this where there's a lot of commercial activity, there's a lot of outsourcing of commercial activity, which is now taking place. A lot of companies, a lot of the non-essential work they give away. Now they might have even for collecting of money or marketing, promotion. All these calls we get all the time.
Yes.
On data protection law is still not got into operation. Yes. So people call you. So those may not be employees of that bank or financial institution. Right. Maybe somebody who's doing it in some other form. So it is so for especially for purposes of these acts, the statutory these benefits, one needs to draw a distinction whether that person or the person you are speaking to is either an employee or an independent contractor, and that it's a thin line. Right. So it's an outsourced activity. There may be characteristics of one being an employee and also independent contractor. So the law also has over the years set out certain tests to identify whether that person, the individual, is an employee or the independent contractor. So there is something called the control test. Who controls the work? Right. Now in that polisher's example, now we don't tell him how to polish. He comes and we hire him to polish, but I don't go and tell him, you
do like
do
this
it like this and use this and that. So we are not controlled. But in my manufacturing outlet, I am telling my say machine operator, well, this is how you must do it. Right. Control test. Then there is something called the integration test.
Right.
Is that person integrated in my business operation. Now, the manufacturing outlet, the person who's working, is part of that setup, but the polisher is not. Then there's economic reality test. Is the employee or the individual we are trying to ascertain dependent continuously on the employer, or is it off and on? So then there is something called a mixed test. So you look at all these attributes to see whether you're an employee or an independent contractor. That is because the laws, the EPF, the ETF, the gratuity, cover only an employee, not an independent contractor. In addition, these pieces of legislation also bring in, for example, apprentices also. With certain special industries, you have people in training, apprentices, but they are also caught up in the legislation, and then you're all bound to go through and pay and also collect. The EPF is where the employer contributes 12% of your salary. The employee, the 8% is deducted, and a 20% is transferred to EPF. So every month, 20% of your salary is being saved. It's like a forced saving. So at the point you retire, you will have that money together with, of course, the investment proceeds of the EPF, which will be paid as a lump sum.
Right. So when it comes to the particular percentages and everything, we discussed about the EPF, ETF, and the scope of the employment and those stuff. So who are being covered with this scenario, and sometimes there might be other provisions who are not covered?
Yes. So first and foremost, for apply to this, it must be an employee in the Contemplation Act, not an independent independent contractor. Then you need to, I will speak in very general terms, then you must look at those who, say the government employees, they are not subject to the EPF, there is a reasoning, they get a pension. The whole idea of this superannuation benefits is to, now you work during your productive work in life, then you retire. So you are entitled to continue your life in the same way you during your work life, and of course your income stops. So you need to either have some big savings which you collect for, or you need to get a pension. So government servants get pensions. So therefore they are not subject to EPF. Then there is also local government situations where they get pensions. Then there are some companies which have private provident funds, either these rates or even more. So if you have an alternate, so the bottom line is, if you are an employee, you need to either get a pension in Sri Lanka, or you get or a private provident fund where you get a better benefit, or you're subject to this. Of course, casual employees are taken out. Then there are other certain types now, say those who are working in household as domestic employees, they are not entitled in terms of the legislation as it is. And then there are some categories like that.
Right. So with your explanation, sir, you termed this as like a forced saving.
Yes.
In that context, EPF, ETF, actually what the purpose of those are?
Yes, the purpose is to ensure that the employee has a safety net, is protected after the work life.
Right.
Because there are some people who might voluntarily save. There are others who may not be inclined to save, and there are others who may not be able to save because you have expenses.
Right.
And even in today's context, it's very difficult. I mean, things are take today.
Yes.
I mean, things are going up, prices are going up, so it's difficult to save. So this regime ensures that if at the end of your work life, you will have some amount which you can then use, maybe invest, and then have some interest and to continue.
Right.
And then these are very difficult. These concepts are maybe brought in the 70s and the 80s. Now, with the advancement of health, medical care, our life expectancies are much more.
Yes.
And so you retire, I mean, these are societal issues. You retire, say, at 55 or 60, and then you live till 85. You have to sustain 20-25 years. I mean, unless your children, I mean, you don't want to be a burden on your children, so then you have, I mean, ultimately your children have to support you. But theoretically, your EPF should be able to, or savings should be able to support that period. So we also need to look at developing this the timelines now. Earlier in 70s and 80s when these were brought, maybe you retire at 55 and your life expectancy is maybe till 70.
70.
Maybe 15 years.
Yes.
But now you might live till 85. So another 15 years. So those are.
Right. Okay. So with that context, we just explained about that 8%, 12% in combination,
That
20%.
is for EPF.
Yes, EPF. And sir, like in any normal scenario, if I am a certain person who is collecting money, saying that I will deposit this on behalf of you, sometimes I can just collect all, saying that I will also deposit some money on behalf of you, and I'm just keeping all the funds with me without depositing.
You can't do
Are the
that.
employees duty bound?
Yes, of course, you can't do that. It's fraud. So the EPF Act provides, there are instances where this has happened. EPF, ETF, payment secretary, all of them provide for mechanisms. One is, of course, you have an account at the EPF.
Right.
So technically you can go and check. There's a B card or something which they use. It's a human resources thing. And you register. So you have an account.
Right.
You move from employment to employment also. Your EPF will be collected in the same source.
Right.
Maybe your number might change. So you can check. If you, assuming you don't check, now you have been working for 5 years, your employer has been saying he's deducting.
Yes.
Then if you realize that you have not been paid, you can, it's a fairly straightforward process. You go to the Commission of Labour, Department of Labour, and you lodge your complaint.
Right.
And you say, I have been paying for this, you have established this. Then they will summon the employer. And they will have an inquiry. And they will first establish a few things. One is, are you an employee?
That means the distinguish between that we discussed
But
earlier.
they say, are you entitled to gratuity? Entitled to EPF or ETF or gratuity? And has that been paid? So if it's not been paid, the employer then will be an order made in the form of final notice, a certificate, saying that this employer is now bound to pay.
Right.
Now the Department of Labour, in terms of these various acts, have different enforcement mechanisms. You can go to the district court, you can go to the magistrates court. What they use is mostly they go to the magistrates court, but that is the most expeditious way of recovering the money.
Right.
So you go before so they issue this final notice and say, Mr. So and so or your company, you are bound to make this payment. If you don't make the payment, then they will file it in the form of the certificate to be filed in the magistrates court by the Department of Labour. Employee doesn't need to even doesn't need to have lawyers or anything. They are appearing for you. Then the magistrate, it's not a case.
Right.
The only function of the magistrate is to recover that money in the form of fine. So it is not for the magistrates court to determine whether it's due or not or anything. Right. There's a few grounds you can look at. One is whether the amount was paid, which maybe after the certificate issued is paid, and a few issues like grounds. But generally, once it goes to the magistrates court, it will be imposed in the form of a fine. And as you know, if you don't pay a fine, then you can be put in jail. Right. And actually, Charita, there have been, I know personally of several situations where reputed people have had to go to jail because of the EPF, ETF issues. Because now 1 or 2 employees, say you don't pay and then you have to pay, you might be able to get your savings. But there have been instances where, like, you have, say, a big manufacturing outlet of 200 people working, and you have not been paying. Right? Either you have either collected and not paid or not collected. And then when those sums become enormous, now you are talking about 12% plus 8%, 20% of the salary every month. Say, and you don't pay for 5 years, say you have 200 employees. When this process goes and the complaint comes, and when the magistrate says, okay, pay 200 million or 300 million, and you don't have that money, then what do you do?
Helpless.
So you might be a big industrialist, but you can't pay that. Then you have to go, they put in jail. And it has happened. I mean, there have been people who ended up in jail.
Right.
Because maybe they didn't, maybe they didn't know what they were doing.
Yes.
You have to get advice. Maybe there may be others who intentionally did it. There's another important point, which I have seen a lot of cases coming up. Sometimes the employer says, well, the employee agreed that he doesn't want EPF and ETF. Now that is a very dangerous situation for the employer. And that might be happening. The employee might come and say, I don't want this. Give it to, we are now 20% now.
Yes.
You are 12% from here, 8% from your salary. You say, well, I don't want CPF. I'm not interested in savings. You give that to add that to my salary and give.
That means the particular.
So you can negotiate. Yes. Say I'm getting 10,000 rupees. No, I give me 12,000 rupees to hand now. Right. I don't want EPF, and he might even sign a document.
Right.
And say. So then the employee also might think, so he doesn't want the EPF. It's a nuisance for me to send this. I'm anyway paying him. I'm being fair. He's signing a document saying he doesn't want. There is no need. That's a very dangerous thing, because what happens is then if the employee doesn't complain, that's fine. Right. But what happens is once he finishes employment and he finishes his savings, someone will tell him he's entitled to EPF and goes and makes a complaint. Right. Then at that point, it's not an excuse for an employer to say, well, there was an agreement. Because the statute mandates that you have to pay. Right. You can't override the statute by agreement, by acquiescence or some kind of agreement. So, advice to all employers also, you need to do it's your responsibility. End of the day, your employee will leave you and become your biggest enemy in this inquiry. Pay your EPF. And at the end of the day, it is not when you are working your salary also you have to pay. You are negotiating, no? There is no, there are minimum wages, but those are very theoretical sums. So you are paying a sum. Yes. So you can factor in your EPF cost, and you can remit it, and you must collect it from the employee and give. Yeah. Then there is no issue. Right. But the issue arises sometimes, maybe a few years later, 10, 20 years later. Later on. Then you have to make that payment.
So the valid contract even performed in between those two parties won't survive?
No, it doesn't, because it's a statutory requirement, a statutory obligation. Agreement between parties can't override it. Well and good if your employee doesn't go and complain. Right. But the likelihood is, at some point, they'll say, well, I didn't know. Then often what employees, I have seen cases, I have appeared for both sides. Right. I have seen cases where the employee says, well, I was told to sign some document. I didn't know, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. Who is there? We are not there at the time. So then the court will say, no, you are liable under the EPF or the ETF Act to collect and remit. You have not done it, you are responsible. And in addition, you can be surcharged up to 50%, even if you delay to pay. The surcharges go up, so you might have to pay 12% of yours, then also the employer is responsible for the employee's contribution. If you don't collect, they have to pay 20% and a surcharge of 50%. So then you're basing 30% of the salary every month for the period of, and that's a huge amount.
Huge amount.
That means they paid once and for all.
Right. So in any case, if the statute or any other legal piece of work that they recommend or they instruct, advise in a certain manner to do this thing, nothing can override.
You can't override it.
Right. So when it comes to foreign nationals working here in Sri Lanka under our scope and purview, what are the applications?
There is some people think they are not, but they fall under the definition of employee, because these acts work on this definition of who an employee is and that you have to pay. So there is no differentiation between foreign national and Sri Lankan national in the definition of employee. So if someone is permanently, even a CEO of a company, say you have known some of these companies from abroad, they are subject to this and they are entitled to EPF. And I have seen situations where foreign nationals are saying, I have not got EPF. Right. So sometimes the employer also doesn't misses it. It's not mala fide, it's a bona fide. They say, you are a foreign employer. Yes. But then later what happens is, initially all is good. Then once you either get fired or you retire and go, then you realize, somebody tells you, well, you are entitled to this, then you make a complaint and then the employee is in trouble.
If there is any trouble or any consequence.
Best is to negotiate. The salary is negotiable. No? So then you can factor in your costs and say, well, I am paying so much. You work it out.
Right. So in any case, like if we are deprived of a certain privilege or any consequence thereafter occurs with this EPF and ETF thing, what is the procedure that we need to follow?
So you have to then go before the easiest procedure from it's the employee who has to complain. Go before the Commissioner of Labour. It's a very easy process and they are very proactive and they are very, this is social legislation, this EPF, ETF. So they will fully support you. You have to establish, you have to present your facts and circumstances. then they will call them. The burden will also be on the employer, but they are supposed to maintain records to establish it. They might take up, and then you will have to, and they will make an order. So it's not difficult at all.
Right. So when we are employed from the very first day, that means like if we are entitled to EPF and ETF, that means what is the date that is being started
No, so
since
from-
the very first day?
From your date of employment, you'll be entirely, provided you fall into this EPF and you're not excluded in any way. And from I think the payment date is the end of the next month. It has to be remitted. So you're entitled to EPF and ETF from day one.
Right. Since the very
Of course,
first
so
day.
there is time to remit. I think I recall the employer is supposed to send the money before the end of the next month. So there is and you have to get the forms and the registration done. So
Right.
that period you have to do.
Right. So with the change of workplace, how it affects, sir?
So you will have to register the new workplace, but your EPF funds will be collected.
It's continuous.
So you will have, I think there is maybe a common number, and also the employer has a different number. So it will be connected at the EPF, and you will have to also connect it, give the old details, the new details.
Right.
There is, I think, a B card or some card like that,
Right.
where you have to. Now with computers, it's not very this thing. So you
Yes.
connect it, and you will, because it adds up. It's like a bank account.
Account, right. In any scenario, if you are changing the workplace, that doesn't
Then you
affect.
have to there are certain circumstances. I am not completely possessed of it, but there are situations where at certain points you can also take the money back. You don't need to wait. And also, I think you can take loans against your
Yes.
EPF balance. It's not that you pull the money out, but you can take a loan against it. So because people need sometimes money.
Right.
But it's always good to have that safety net. You
That
don't know
means-
when you will,
Yes, it's like a safety. That means a
It's a
fund
sa-
that is being
it-
built
it's
for
vital
saving.
because we don't know how you'll fall ill. You'll have some medical treatment you need to do. We don't know,
Yes.
and you don't know how long you're working. So this is this safety net.
Right. Okay. So thank you very much, sir, for discussing this topic, EPF and ETF related issues, widely discussed, and a certain area that people deal with certain many consequences with regard to their employment opportunities and even repayment of those things, and even many consequences offer without knowing the real scope of this EPF and ETF. So thank you very much, sir, once again for joining with us with Law and Order program. So ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned with Law and Order. We'll be discussing more interesting topics in the future as well. Thank you very much for watching. Have a pleasant day.